All right, so in this section of the chapter, we're going to talk about specifically the three phases and systems of memory. So let's start off here first talking about the three phases of memory. So when we talk about this, we're going to jump in here. When we talk about this, we talk about memory specifically being sort of how we structure and how we store information in the brain. And so this kind of has three different phases to it when we're talking about how memory works. And so the first phase is encoding. This is the process of actually how we get the information stored, or how we get the information in the first place. So we encode that information, we learn that information, we turn it into something our brain can understand and our brain can store. And so then, of course, the second phase is the storage phase. And so this it talks about how we actually keep that information and retain that information either over a short period of time or maybe a long period of time in either short or long-term memory. And so that storage process, that storage phase is a crucial part of memory as well. But then finally as well, here, let me jump out of the way, we have retrieval. And the retrieval process is really how we get that information back out to do something with it, whether that's to remember it, whether that's to, kind of edit it or do something else with it. We have to retrieve that information from storage in order to remember it and in order to kind of have some use for that memory. And so we're now going to talk about the three systems of memory. And so the main three systems of memory we have are specifically sensory memory, working memory, and then long-term memory. And those are kind of how we're going to talk about them for right now as those three sort of main systems or types of memory. So let's first start off by talking about sensory memory. So sensory memory is really cool, and it also is a very, very short period of memory. So when we talk about our senses, we can talk about sort of the physical components of how we sense information, the actual photons, our actual photoreceptors within our eyes, sensing the light inside the environment. And that is our sensing of the information. Same thing auditorily, we have our cochlea, which receive information and detect and interpret sort of the sound waves in our environment. So when we talk about sensory memory, we're really talking about those physical structures within our senses retaining the information that they've been given for very, very short periods of time. And so if we look at this example here, we can see one of these early studies that kind of demonstrated this. And this was a really, really cool study, and it's kind of fun to try and break down and understand. So what was done is they took this grid, this array of letters, random letters, and they presented it to a participant for a very, very short period of time, roughly 50 milliseconds. So a very short period of time. They basically flashed on the screen. And so what their senses did, their eyes, their photoreceptors were taking in that information, and they saw it for a split second. And then they asked them to recite or recreate or repeat what those letters were. And participants were fairly inaccurate, right? It was a really fast period of time. They weren't able to store all of this information and remember what it all was that fast. However, then what they did is they gave some other type of cue to help kind of reduce and limit down the information that they needed to remember. So rather than having them recall the entire grid, they presented either a high tone, so like a high pitch tone, a mid pitch tone, or a low pitch tone, to have them remember either the top row, indicating if it was a high pitch, the middle row for a mid tone, or the low row if it was the low tone. And so rather than having to tell them in a more complex way, which would take too long, or present information visually, which would overwrite this visual memory that was taking place, they just quickly presented a tone, either high, mid, or low, which indicated to the participant which row they should remember and which row they should recite. And what's really cool is that this was enough for them to be able to accurately remember kind of what was in the given row that they were told to remember. And so while they couldn't remember the whole series or the whole grid, if they limited that down, they were pretty accurate at responding to a subsection of the grid. And so the reason for having the tones, right, is so that there was no preconceived like, oh, I'm going to remember the top row because that's the one I know I need to recite. They didn't know which row it was going to be, so they had to take in all of the information And then when the sound came on, they were able to report the accurate information from that row. And so what's really cool about this, and kind of the takeaway from this, or this evidence for sensory memory, is that if we asked them to report the whole thing, they couldn't do it, right? But if we asked them to report one random piece of it, they could. And so how is that the case if they aren't remembering the whole thing? Well, it seems that actually they were remembering the whole thing, but only for a very, very short period of time that we could access quickly, and then it kind of went away. So this was really cool, and it again provided evidence for sensory memory. This is sort of that idea where if you almost like are in a dark environment and you see a flash of light, you almost get that like memory of whatever that flash was. You can see it sort of even with your eyes closed for a short period of time, and then it fades over time. So this is kind of like that idea where it is sensory memory that is taking place. Let's now talk a little bit about working memory. So working memory is the second type, or the second system of memory that we're going to kind of break down and talk about. And working memory kind of falls into this organized structure of memory. So first and foremost, we have the central executive. This is the piece that really is in charge of kind of directing and organizing and telling information where it should go. So should it go over to the auditory side or the visual side? This is really the piece that tells things where they should go. Then we have the phonological loop. And this section, this is the auditory piece of working memory, sort of the idea of your inner voice, right? So if you are reciting sort of orders at a drive-through that your friends have all given you and you're the one who has to order at the window, you might be kind of reciting what those orders were kind of over and over again. This is that idea of the phonological loop. So it keeps that information in working memory, able to be accessed, able to be sort of, pulled and used in that time. Then we have the episodic buffer. This is really just a storage where we can kind of store information for short periods of time, temporary general storage. And then again, we have the visuospatial sketchpad. This is like our inner eye. So maybe you have some visual memory of something, and you can keep this kind of in your working memory as you're kind of visualizing it in your inner eye as we go. And we'll see some examples of this here as well. So when we talk about the inner eye, when we're talking about sort of that visuospatial sketchpad, we can see if we think about some different objects, we can sort of picture them in our mind maybe. And what's really interesting, what's really cool is that we actually see this almost represented in a one-to-one spatial and size to the real world. And so what I mean by that is if I were to ask you to, picture an airplane and then picture sort of, the seat on an airplane or the next sort of piece of what that is. And so what's really interesting about this is that you're going to actually manipulate these objects and view these objects in your mind in the same way you would physically in the real world. And so, if you took an airplane and you pictured it next to a chair, you were going to picture that airplane larger than the chair. And it would take you longer to scan and think through the pieces of the airplane compared to the chair. On the other hand, if I asked you to picture an airplane and a planet, right, you would picture that airplane smaller than the planet, and you would view it and have the details of it representative in the same kind of way that you would to the planet. So you'd have less details of the plane if you view it next to a planet than if you were to take a plane next to a chair, because it'd be blown up proportionally size-wise compared to the other objects. So it's really cool kind of how that works and actually mimics the real world in how we imagine things. So when we talk about working memory, another important thing, or two important things to kind of talk about, is both the duration and the capacity to how much we can store in working memory. And so when we're talking about the duration of memory and how long we can retain information, we see generally this lasts for roughly, 7 seconds or so is the cutoff that we tend to see. So when we look at these letters presented and the accuracy in recalling them, we see a sharper decline around 7 seconds. And so if we ask participants to recite, say, a string of 3 letters, and then ask them to recall what those letters were at varying points in time, we can see that they get less and less accurate over seconds as we see. And at around 7 seconds, roughly, we see a sharper decline here appearing. And so while we see this distinction does begin to drop almost immediately, this cutoff of about 50% is right around that 7-second mark. And so people get worse than 50% after about 7 seconds. So we talk about this duration being anywhere kind of between 7 seconds and potentially even up to maybe 15 seconds, being able to store some amount of information to useful degrees. Then if we talk about the capacity, so how much can we actually hold in our mind at once? Well, this is a really interesting one, and it does vary a little bit depending on how you choose to store the information. Also, it varies based on if we're talking about auditory or visual information, but generally speaking, we can hold, we say, 7 plus or minus 2 items in our memory. So 5 to 9 items in our working memory at once. However, there are ways that we can sort of trick our mind into remembering more than that number. And so I love giving this example, this demonstration, but take a look at these numbers, take a look at this string of numbers, and read over these numbers, try and remember what these numbers are, and then close your eyes or look away from the screen and see if you can remember what all of these numbers are. And you can pause the video if you need for a minute, try and do this. So what's really cool is we'll see if I can do this. I'll see if I can kind of memorize these numbers. We'll look at them real quick, and I'll try and remember what they are. And let's see. So can I do 0, 2, 1, 4, 0, 7, 0, 4, 1, 0, 3, 1, 1, 2, 2, 5. I think I got all of those numbers correct. And how did I do that? Well, I'll give you a trick. So if we use what's called chunking, we can chunk these into groups to only remember really 4 different groups. And so what's interesting too about these numbers is that these chunks are meaningful chunks. So if we look at each of these numbers, do they make sense? Do they stand out to you in what they mean? Well, we can see that the first number here is the date of February 14th, or Valentine's Day. Then we have July 4th. Then we have October 31st and December 25th. So we have Valentine's Day, July 4th, Halloween, and Christmas. And so those 4 meaningful dates make it easy to remember this long, previously seemingly arbitrary list of numbers. So a pretty fun trick. It's a fun one to kind of go out and try with other people once you know how to do it too. And the third type of memory we can talk about here is long-term memory. So we've had sensory memory, we've had working memory, and now we have long-term memory. And so with long-term memory, there's really 3 main types of long-term memory. We have episodic memory, and this is basically things that have happened to you in your life, episodes of your life. So specific events that have taken place, personally experienced memories, or things that you've encountered. These are episodes, these are episodic memories that you remember for long periods of time. Then we have semantic memory. This is more just like facts or meanings of things that you kind of remember, that you've learned, and you know this to be the case. So these are, basically just facts about the world or meaning to different things that you might know. And then lastly, we have procedural memory, and this is basically the steps to complete some task. So maybe that is, you know how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich because you know the procedures and the steps to do that, and that is stored in long-term memory. Maybe that's, you know how to ride a bike because you have those steps stored in long-term memory. And we can see kind of the distinction too between maybe procedural memory that is really easy to recite, like how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, versus procedural memory that is more intuitive or subconscious, like how to ride a bike, where you might not know the exact steps that you're taking, but you have learned them nonetheless, and they still exist in this form of procedural memory in long-term memory. So again, all of these types are forms of long-term memory that we have here as well. So we've talked about all 3, sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory.